Imagine waking up one morning, checking your investment account, and for the first time, the number staring back at you doesn't feel like hope. It feels like momentum. You're still the same person, sitting in the same small apartment, sipping the same cheap coffee, but something in your chest feels different, almost like a quiet confidence you didn't know you were allowed to have. And here's the strange thing. Nothing magical happens at $250,000, but somehow everything starts to shift: your psychology, your stress level, your choices, even the way you carry yourself. Why? Because at that point, money stops being something you chase and starts becoming something that quietly works for you. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why that moment changes your entire financial life, and maybe your identity too. My name is Tony, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, psychology, and how emotions shape everything. If you're tired of being told to hustle without clarity, make sure to hit subscribe and like if this makes you think differently. Now, here's something that will blow your mind. There's a moment in everyone's financial journey where things quietly begin to feel different. It doesn't announce itself. There's no celebration, no applause. Sometimes you don't even realize it until weeks later. But one day you log into your investment account and something inside you pauses. The number isn't just big, it feels stable. And that's when you know you've crossed a psychological threshold no one ever warned you about. Here's the thing. Most people think wealth feels like luxury, like Lamborghinis, infinity pools, or some dramatic movie moment where everything suddenly makes sense. But the truth is much softer, much quieter. Wealth, real wealth, begins as a feeling of emotional safety. And the first time most people ever feel that is when they hit around $250,000 invested. Now, I know that number might sound random, but stay with me for a second. There are phases in the investing journey that don't get talked about because they're more psychological than financial. Your first $10K, it feels good but fragile. Your first $50K, encouraging, but you still feel like you could lose it all. Your first $100K, inspiring, but you still sense that the mountain ahead of you is bigger than the one behind you. But $250,000, that's different. Because that's the point where compounding stops being theoretical and starts being felt. That's when the math begins to translate into emotion. Think about it. In an average year, $250K invested might grow by $20,000 without you doing anything. That's more than most people save manually. And when you realize your money is now working harder than you are, something in your identity shifts. And this is where it gets interesting. Up until this point, your financial progress is driven by effort. Saving, budgeting, discipline, saying no, sacrificing weekends, resisting temptations, fighting old habits. It feels like you're climbing a steep hill with a backpack full of rocks. But at $250K, the hill begins to level out. You feel the incline soften. The rocks suddenly weigh a little less. And for the first time, you don't feel like you're fighting gravity anymore. You feel like you're moving with it. There's this moment, and if you haven't felt it yet, you will, where you catch yourself thinking, wait, I might actually be okay. Not rich, not done, but okay. And that feeling is life-changing. See, humans aren't wired to respond to numbers. We respond to perceived momentum, to patterns, to emotional consistency. And $250K is the first time in most people's lives where that inner pattern shifts from anxiety to stability. It's like building a house. At first, everything is shaky. You're pouring concrete, hoping it dries. You're assembling beams, hoping they hold. But once the foundation sets, once it's strong, every brick you stack finally feels like progress instead of risk. That's what $250K is. The moment the financial foundation stops wobbling. And the irony? Nobody talks about it. Not schools, not workplaces, not even most financial experts. because this milestone isn't just about money, it's about psychology. It's about finally being far enough along that the emotional noise quiets down. But here's the part that matters. This isn't the finish line, it's the doorway. The beginning of the phase where wealth stops feeling abstract and starts feeling inevitable. And that is where we're headed next. Because once you understand the psychology behind compounding, once you see why your brain fights you in the early stages, everything about your financial journey begins to make sense. If chapter 1 was about that quiet moment when something shifts, then this chapter is about understanding why it shifts at all. Because compounding isn't just a financial phenomenon, it's a psychological one. And most people never experience its real power, not because they don't invest, but because their brain gives up long before the math kicks in. Let's start from something simple. Compounding, as a math concept, makes perfect sense. You invest money, the money grows, that growth grows, and eventually the curve bends upward. Easy, right? But emotionally, it's torture. In the early years, you put in $500 or $1,000 or $5,000, and your account moves by $23.17. Your brain looks at that and goes, seriously? All that sacrifice for this? The progress is invisible, which to the human mind feels identical to failure. And here's the thing, your brain is still running, software evolved in a world of immediate feedback. Hunger eat, danger hide, effort reward. The modern world broke that loop. Investing forces you into delayed gratification, the exact opposite of how the brain feels safe. That's why the first few years feel like pushing a heavy car with the engine off. You're sweating, you're straining, you're second guessing, and the car barely moves an inch. But then something strange happens around the $250K mark. The engine turns on. Not literally, of course, but psychologically. Suddenly, market returns are no longer tiny ripples, they're waves. Returns that used to be $15 are now $1,500. Gains that took 6 months now happen in 6 weeks. And your brain for the first time believes. Think about this for a moment. When you're early in your journey, your contributions create 95% of your growth. You are the engine. Your paycheck is the engine. Your discipline is the engine. And that's exhausting. But at $250K, the ratio begins to flip. Most years, your money produces more growth than your labor. You're no longer pushing the car. You're steering it. And this is where the emotional unlock happens. There is a cognitive bias called progress bias. Humans feel motivated when progress is visible, but in investing, visible progress doesn't happen until compounding becomes meaningful, and that doesn't happen until the numbers get big enough to matter emotionally. When your investments make more than you save, your brain treats it like a second income. A quiet one, a passive one, a dependable one. One study from the Journal of Behavioral Finance found that investors don't psychologically internalize compounding until their portfolio generates returns equivalent to at least 1 month of living expenses. Below that, it barely registers as real, and for many people, that point is around $250,000 invested. It's the moment where your annual returns might cover rent, or groceries, or your car for the year. Suddenly, your money isn't growing, it's providing. That shift from growth to provision is what changes everything. And here's a metaphor to make this stick. Imagine planting bamboo. For years, it barely grows above the soil. You water it, you nurture it, you stare at it, wondering if you made a mistake. But in the 5th year, something crazy happens. It shoots up 80 feet in 6 weeks. Your investments are bamboo. The early years are nothing but invisible root building. Quiet, frustrating, painfully slow. But the $250,000 mark, that's the moment the shoot breaks through the surface. That's when you finally see what was happening underground the whole time. And once you see it, the doubt dissolves. Because at that point, the question changes from, is this working? To how much more powerful will this get? And that's where compounding transforms from a hope into a system that no longer relies on your emotional endurance because it now sustains itself. But here's the part most people never think about. Once compounding becomes emotionally real, your entire life starts to feel lighter. Not because you're wealthy, but because you're no longer fighting your brain's survival instincts. And that shift leads us straight into the next chapter. Because when compounding becomes real, life feels different, and the weight you've been carrying for years begins to lift. There's a moment, and it's subtle, where life just starts to feel a little bit lighter, not because any external circumstances have changed, not because you suddenly got a promotion, not because you won the lottery or inherited money, but because internally, something unclenches. That happens around $250,000 invested. And here's the thing most people don't realize. Money changes your life long before it changes your lifestyle. You might still be living in the same apartment, driving the same used car, eating the same budget-friendly meals, but the feeling of life shifts quietly, consistently, deeply. Let me explain what's happening underneath the surface. For most of your life, bills don't just exist, they loom. Rent feels like a threat. A flat tire feels like a crisis. A medical bill feels like a loss of control. Even small expenses carry emotional weight because part of your brain knows, I can't afford many mistakes. That's scarcity. Not in the financial sense, in the psychological sense. Scarcity isn't about not having enough money. It's about not having enough margin. And until your investments reach a certain point, every decision feels like it has too much riding on it. You choose jobs out of fear. You avoid risks out of necessity. You tolerate things you shouldn't because you can't afford not to. But at $250K invested, something shifts. Your portfolio can now absorb shocks. Your returns can now cover real-life expenses. Your margin emotionally and financially expands, and when margin expands, fear contracts. You start noticing tiny changes in your behavior. You say no more quietly, more calmly. You negotiate with less hesitation. You sleep a little easier. You stop replaying worst-case scenarios in your head because, honestly, you finally feel like you could handle one. Here's a metaphor to ground this. Imagine standing on a wooden bridge that's old and creaky. Every step feels risky. You move slowly, cautiously, always testing the planks. That's financial scarcity. Now imagine stepping onto a steel bridge. Same path, same destination, but suddenly you can breathe. You walk with confidence because you trust what's beneath you. Your $250K is that steel bridge. Not luxurious, not extravagant, but safe. And that safety bleeds into every part of your life. You begin making choices from a place of stability instead of fear. You start thinking long term instead of reacting short term. You give yourself permission to consider happiness, not just survival. Even your relationships feel lighter because money stress is no longer humming in the background like a constant static noise. And here's something most people never admit. When you have no financial cushion, even good things feel stressful. Opportunities feel risky. Choices feel dangerous. Growth feels expensive. But with $250K working quietly in the background, opportunities stop feeling like cliffs and start feeling like doors. And that's the moment when identity starts to shift. You stop seeing yourself as the person fighting to make it, and you start seeing yourself as the person who probably will, not because anything magical happened, but because the math finally supports the hope. A portfolio of that size creates a sense of inevitability. Not guaranteed wealth, but a guaranteed trajectory. You're on the path, you're moving, you're stable, and that's why life feels lighter. Because for the first time, you're not just surviving the present, you're shaping the future. But here's the part that people don't see coming. Once life feels lighter, momentum accelerates. Your decisions get better. Your discipline becomes easier. Your stress decreases. And suddenly, your wealth building flywheel begins turning faster than ever. Which brings us to the next chapter, the part where the wealth engine finally reveals itself. And trust me, this is where everything starts to click. If the last chapter was about life feeling lighter, this one is about why everything begins to speed up. Because once you hit around $250,000 invested, something powerful and almost invisible snaps into place. Your wealth stops behaving like a project and starts behaving like a system. Let me start with a simple image. Picture a giant flywheel, one of those massive metal wheels used in old factories. At first, it barely moves. You push with everything you've got, and it inches forward. You push again, and it moves a tiny bit more. It's frustrating, slow, and honestly, it feels pointless. That's the first 5 to 10 years of investing. Your contributions matter more than your returns. Your effort outweighs your results. And every push feels like it's fighting gravity. But the physics of a flywheel are strange. Once it builds enough momentum, it turns itself, and that's exactly what happens around the $250,000 mark. Your money finally reaches a mass, a financial weight, where compounding isn't something you hope for, it's something you feel. The wheel begins spinning faster with every rotation, not because you're pushing harder, but because the previous pushes are now helping you. Think about this mathematically for a moment. At $250,000 invested, 8% returns equal $20,000 a year. That's money you didn't work for, didn't clock in for, didn't bargain for, didn't sacrifice weekends for. Your wealth begins producing its own income stream quietly, reliably, almost indifferently. And that income does something psychologically profound. It reinforces your identity as someone who is building, not chasing. Now, here's the part most people overlook. The wealth flywheel isn't just about compounding. It's a combination of emotional, behavioral, and financial loops feeding into each other. 1. Consistency feels easier. When you see real progress, discipline stops feeling like punishment. You don't force yourself to invest you want to. It feels meaningful. 2. Lifestyle inflation slows down. You finally feel stable, less insecure, less reactive. Suddenly, you're not trying to prove anything with spending. You buy less because you need less. 3. Good decisions come naturally. You stop making choices from fear and start making them from clarity. Stress declines, mistakes reduce. Your future self-thinking sharpens. 4. Compounding accelerates. Bigger base, bigger returns, calmer decisions, more investing, bigger base again. That loop, those 4 pieces, is the wealth flywheel. But here's the catch. You can't feel this flywheel at $5K. You can't feel it at $20K. You can barely feel it at $100K. Not because the math isn't working, but because the math isn't emotionally meaningful yet. Most of compounding's power is psychological, not financial. And when your portfolio hits the point where its returns outweigh your contributions, a silent shift occurs. You stop relying on willpower, and the system starts pulling you forward. You're no longer climbing the mountain. You're being pushed up it. But here's the part that often goes unsaid. Getting to $250K requires becoming a certain type of person, disciplined, patient, consistent, emotionally grounded, but staying on the path requires an even deeper internal transformation. Because once the flywheel starts spinning, you face a new challenge. Not self-discipline, not budgeting, not strategy, but identity. And that brings us to the emotional peak of this story. Because the hardest part isn't reaching $250K, it's becoming the person who doesn't sabotage it. If the wealth flywheel begins turning at $250,000, this is the chapter where we talk about the part nobody prepares you for. The part that's quiet, internal, psychological. The battle that doesn't happen in your bank account but in your identity. Because here's the truth that surprises almost everyone. Like, getting to $250K is mostly math. Staying on the path after $250K is mostly emotional maturity. Let me explain. When you're early in your financial journey, your biggest obstacles are obvious: debt, low income, lack of knowledge, inconsistent habits, poor budgeting. They're practical, visible, you can point to them. But once you've built some wealth, your biggest obstacles become invisible: self-sabotage, impatience, boredom, comparison, fear of losing money, fear of changing into someone you don't recognize. These don't show up on a spreadsheet, but they hit you harder than any market downturn ever could. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Your identity, the story you've told yourself about who you are, was shaped during the years when money was scarce, when life felt heavy, when every dollar mattered, when you were surviving, not building. And even after you grow, that identity lingers. You still feel the urge to catch up, to overwork, to push harder than necessary, to treat every financial decision like a crisis, because your nervous system learned to operate in emergency mode. But at $250,000 invested, emergency mode becomes the biggest thing holding you back. Not the market, not your income, not your expenses, you. There's a psychological phenomenon called upper limit fear. It's when people unconsciously sabotage themselves the moment life improves beyond what their identity is comfortable with. And financially, it shows up in sneaky ways. You stop investing for a few months. You spend impulsively. You chase riskier investments. You take profits too early. You panic when the market dips. You upgrade your lifestyle too quickly. You slip back into old patterns not because you're weak, but because your old self doesn't know how to live with stability. Think about that for a second. It's not the money that changes everything. It's your relationship to yourself. You have to grow into someone who trusts long-term progress, someone who can tolerate delayed gratification, someone who doesn't need chaos to feel normal, someone who isn't addicted to financial adrenaline. And here's the hopeful part. Once you recognize this, everything becomes easier, because the battle is no longer mysterious. You're not bad with money. You're not undisciplined. You're not falling off. You're simply shedding the identity shaped during survival mode. And when that clicks, when you finally become the person who doesn't sabotage themselves, the next phase of wealth building becomes effortless. Because now the numbers and the psychology are working on your side. And this brings us to the final chapter, the moment where everything inside you shifts into a new identity, the point where you truly begin building, not surviving. And trust me, this is where the journey becomes beautiful. There's a moment, and it's almost never loud, where you finally realize you've stepped into a new version of yourself, not because of a raise, not because of a financial windfall, not because of some achievement the world can see, but because internally, something finally feels safe. That moment often arrives shortly after hitting $250,000 invested. And here's the thing. This milestone doesn't make you wealthy. It makes you calm. It gives you a feeling you may have never had before: the freedom to think long-term without fear pulling you backward. You don't wake up hoping things will go right anymore. You wake up trusting that you can handle things even if they don't. It's a shift from fragility to stability, from I hope to I know, from surviving to building. And it shows up in dozens of small, almost invisible ways. You pause before buying something not because you're scared, but because you're intentional. You choose jobs based on meaning, not desperation. You save without forcing yourself. You invest without doubting yourself. You stop comparing your timeline to everyone else's because you finally believe in your own. This is the identity shift that changes everything. Because once you stop living in emotional scarcity, you also stop making scarcity-based decisions. You allow yourself to play the long game. You allow yourself to rest without guilt. You allow yourself to build without panic. There's a metaphor I love for this. Imagine planting a tree. For years you water it, protect it, nurture it. You don't get shade right away. You don't get fruit right away. But one year, you sit under it and realize the tree is strong enough now that it doesn't need your constant protection. That's what your financial life becomes after this milestone. Not perfect, not effortless, but steady. You no longer live in fear of losing everything. You live in confidence that you can rebuild anything. And here's the beautiful part. When this identity settles in, your wealth building journey becomes less about escaping something and more about moving toward the life you actually want. You're not running anymore. You're choosing. So, as we close this journey, I want to leave you with one question, the same one that changes people far more than numbers ever will. Who do you become once money stops being the enemy and finally becomes your partner? Because that's the real transformation waiting for you on the other side.